Welcome to our first ever forum session. My name is Jacob. I'm one of the co-founders of Gitwit, along with Dan. So the genesis of this, Dan was the first person who taught me that creativity was something that could be learned and therefore taught, and that it all starts with defining the right problem. And that's kind of the genesis of today, because Gitwit was founded on these ideas. And as resistant as we were to creating any type of vision statement for Gitwit, we actually created one a handful of years back. And in that, we talked about how we can use our creative processes and our methodologies to impact the world around us. And one of those things was sharing that with other people. So we made some good strides in that over the past year. We brought on our first head of learning, Amanda Turk, who will be presenting today. And this is our first foray into sharing something that's core to what we do with a broader audience. So thank you for being a guinea pig and for coming to check this out. We had a series of 14 emails to go out, and we sent one. We're like, oh shit, cancel the other 13. The first time that's ever happened on a campaign ever. So thank you for making us feel good about what we're doing here. Okay, so quick intro, and then we'll hand it off to the rest of the team. So the whole idea here is that product market fit comes from the right problem. And this is really true in startup world, but we find that we're doing this with growth-focused companies all the time, that you find all these initiatives, all these projects where they've not taken the time to define what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve, and they stay in solution mode. And so this idea of teaching people how to stay in problem mode and defining the right problem is what today is all about, with kind of the most accessible but least understood tool, and that's kind of the customer discovery interview. So today we're going to share with you some of the tactics that we use at Gitwit to ensure we're focused on a problem that is worth solving. So we're going to go fast, and we've got a good overview, but then we've also got just some of the tools that we've curated over the years that we're going to share out to you guys as well. All of this stuff, so Gitwit's kind of now split into these three groups: an insights and consulting group, a product and marketing group. And what we're talking about now of uncovering the right problem is what feeds all of these things, right? So whether you're in a product capacity, whether you're in a marketing capacity, knowing here's the problem we're solving and for who becomes core to unlocking everything from your product roadmap all the way to how you want to talk about it as you're getting into growth mode. Okay, so with that, insights and consulting team. So you've got Dan Fisher. For those who haven't met Dan, Dan's background is really on the research side of the house. Got a PhD in consumer behavior and is the person who has helped us build a lot of the methodologies that we use to go search for these insights. We have Kassie McClung, who we were trying to find somebody else to come into our research team, and I called this firm that I've gotten to know out of San Francisco. I'm like, I can't find anybody in Tulsa. He said, maybe go find an investigative journalist. That is how we found Kassie. So somebody on our team was like, I know a great one here in town. That was a couple years ago. So now Kassie is using those same skills to get in and dig for insights. Then we have Amanda Turk, who's got an interesting pathway to get here. So went to MIT and studied mechanical engineering and physics, but then had this deep passion for learning, got into product management. And so her step into Gitwit is kind of bringing those two things together. So with that, we'll get going.
Right, thanks for coming out today. Let me make the business case for the discovery interview to find problems. We live in a world of hyper-specialized roles, job roles, lifestyles, and there are so many more intricacies, complexities, journeys, and details about how we live and how we do things that are down in those details of what people are thinking, doing, and feeling. The problem is, there's a, what happened there? There we go. Ta-da. The problem is there's an overemphasis in business and in the way we train people to research and understand the world in business on the left side of this consumer research spectrum. Where surveys are very short things that you take. They go about an inch deep, and they have a fixed response scenario. So you can only just circle something and say, that's me. Experiments abstract away from context. They simplify. And they basically take all context out, and so they're just trying to get the behavior. And the big question is, what you learn in an experiment, does it translate to the real world? What you learn in the lab, does it translate? I'll give you an example. Who's Mr. Irrelevant in the NFL? Brock Purdy. Chosen last. NFL has its own experiment called the Combine. The Combine makes you do the 40-yard dash, do bench press, do how fast can you throw a ball, all that. He almost didn't get drafted because he did terrible in the experiment. But he ended up being kind of a star. Tom Brady, same thing, was number 199 instead of 264, but he was almost at the end. So ACT, SAT tests are experiments, and they have almost no correlation to academic or career success. But it's quantitative. And so these methods are seen as more objective by business people because they get MBAs and they go, well, we need the numbers to justify this. But it's much more confirmatory on this side. On this side are interviews, which we're going to be talking about today, and ethnography. And ethnography is actually participant observation, where you go into an environment and you live the experience with the people. Interviews are getting that deep, rich, thick experience through questions and dialogue and conversation, okay? Who uses this side? Innovators. You're talking IDEO, you're talking Google, they use these methods on the right side of interviews and ethnography. But there's very little training. In market research classes, you spend almost all your time on surveys. No one ever teaches you how to actually do an interview. And is there a technique to it? Is there a better way to do it? So today you're going to learn a little bit more about something that, that a lot of people don't know enough about. Get into that. Sorry, I knocked that down. One of the hardest things about innovating in companies is it is easy to say no to something new. You often live in that organization that it's easy to say no. No one gets fired for saying no. People get fired for saying yes to imaginative ideas. So you can't make a strong case based on a problem in our world. All right? Because we live in a society of the solution. You make the case by being overwhelmingly persuasive about an idea, a solution. And we live in this solution-first society because we're taught that way from the very beginning, okay? You're smart if you have an answer right away. If you ask a question, it's a signal that you maybe don't know or you're insubordinate because you're challenging. Okay? So by the time you're in 7th or 8th grade, you're not asking questions anymore. And there's no class on how do you ask a better question or anything. If you actually go walk into school, you almost hear no questions being asked. They shut off very early, okay? Plus, we've never been trained to go find a problem. Ever since you started school, even all the way through college, you've been supplied a problem that you have to solve. So you get good at saying, well, the best thing I can do is have an answer, but you've never been trained, how do I actually go find that problem? So we're in the same mode when you're in an organization and you say, hey, I got to sell something. You got to go chase the funding. And you're not worried about the problem. That's not going to maybe factor that much, but it will make a difference in the product market fit when you do actually get funding for it. So you end up becoming a preacher and a prosecutor in order to sell to your stakeholders, in order to marshal the capital, the team, the people, and the political backing. You have to instill belief and faith in an idea. So I borrowed some of these categories from Adam Grant's book, Rethink, and he said, a lot of times we're in this preacher mode where we have to instill faith. We have to show that we believe to get others to believe. And then we're in prosecutor mode because we're in a competition for resources and we have to shoot down things that kind of go against what we're believing and so on. So from the beginning, this puts you in a defensive and dismissive mindset. You're not in a learning mode. you're in a I gotta get funding, I gotta go mode. So you become less open to learning, questioning, rethinking, and revising. And course changing becomes really hard because of the story you've sold. There's a word that you've probably heard a lot, pivot. We use it all the time, but what happens is nobody actually really pivots a whole lot. They just talk about it, and because you've sold a story to a team in your company, and there's a lot writing on this. If you change your mind, there's this whole idea of, oh, you changed your mind, you don't really believe in it, you're not really authentic, all this goes with that. And now we have these innovator mythologies that reinforce you're supposed to remain optimistic, resilient, and gritty. Angela Duckworth's definition of gritty is perseverance combined with passion. And it's like, I don't care what the world tells me, I'm gonna stick with what I'm doing, and that can be dangerous too. Okay, so, one of the biggest turning points in human civilization, perhaps the biggest turning point in human civilization, is the embrace of doubt and skepticism with the scientific mode, all right? No longer should we take things for granted on faith or authority. Scientists look for disconfirming evidence to prove something right or wrong for the moment. And that's actually where they discover what's unsolved and where's the new problem. So the science mode is key to finding that new problem. It's the joy of being wrong that pushes us forward, all right? But we're taught early on never to be wrong. You get punished, you get bad grades, but science introduces doubt, and doubt doesn't really secure you funding in a corporation. So you play this mode, but now you got to think about, how do I become a scientist kind of in a different mode as I try to get funding? So this puts you in a different mode when you go talk to customers, when you want to learn from them, and it puts you in an open-minded mindset, okay? So the sale call casts your team into preacher and prosecutor mode while placing prospects into a defensive skeptical mode. If you're trying to sell somebody, you already have the shields up in a way, and you almost can't trust what they say. So the rest of the presentation that Kassie and Amanda are going to be diving into the tactics, or how to do a discovery interview. But it's a change of frame. The discovery interview places you into a scientific or learning mode and out of the selling mode. You're going to learn the things about how do you uncover the problems people have in the details of their life. How do you ask questions? So it radically changes the dynamic between you and prospects. They become an insider, a collaborator. You build rapport and empathy. And one of the things we've learned is if we do a discovery interview, it's actually some of our best sales calls, because we establish a whole different relationship, and they go, I'm interested in what you're talking about. If you solve this problem, I'm really interested. And so that's one of the key things I want you to take away today is the discovery interview can actually be one of your best sales calls that you make as you're trying to find a product in a market to buy what your new idea is. So now we get into the really good stuff. How to do this.
Thanks. Okay, so now that Dan's made the business case for a discovery interview, Kassie and I are going to take y'all on a crash course through some of the tactics and techniques that Gitwit uses when we do discovery interviews as a part of our work. But I want to just start off by framing this. An interview, it should be conversational, but it's more than just a conversation, right? We all have conversations with people every day, so it's really easy to come into this and just take a more ad hoc approach. But like Dan said, this is about shifting into a little bit more of a scientific mindset, and that means that you want to have a methodology and a rigorous approach to how you're coming at this. Ultimately, what you learn out of these discovery interviews is only as good as your methodology. So that comes down to the questions you ask, the way you ask them, the people that you talk to, and then also how do you organize and interpret and digest all of that contextual information that comes out of these discovery interviews that you've done. So we're going to walk you through some of the elements of Gitwit's methodology for discovery interviews today. And there's 4 topics that we're going to touch on. So one of them is, how do you figure out the right questions to ask? We're going to go through some tools and strategies for figuring that out. Once you have the ideas for those questions, how do you organize them in such a way that you can craft a discussion guide that will help you actually move through those interviews? Then we're going to talk about actually conducting the interview. How do you ask the right people in the right way? And finally, we're going to dig a little bit into what do you do with all that information when you come out the other side. So 4 different pieces. I do just want to emphasize here, it's really easy to look at this and be like, okay, like we're going to do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm going to be done. Discovery is inherently a nonlinear process because it's all about learning. So you're definitely going to learn things in the middle of these interviews that cause you to take a step back and question maybe your initial hypothesis or even the initial direction that you were going in. So you may go back and forth between all of these steps over the course of a rigorous discovery process. So just something to keep in mind. We're going to go through these 4 stages in order, but you may actually hop back and forth between them in the process of doing this, this investigation. Okay, so first, asking the right questions. Asking the right questions, like Dan said, is a really important skill. It's something that we, as a society, just don't emphasize enough. We're trained to find answers, but we're not really trained to think about the questions that we ask to get at those answers. This is a quote from the book A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger. Questioning, it's more important today than it was yesterday, and it will become even more important tomorrow. It helps us to figure out what matters, where the opportunity lies, and how we can get there. We're all hungry for better answers, but before we can get to those better answers, we need to learn how to ask the right questions. So this, more than anything, is super foundational to getting what you need out of a discovery interview. And ultimately, coming up with the right questions are the building blocks to what we call a discussion guide at Gitwit. This is really the ultimate interviewer's tool. You're not going to create a list of questions that you just read off and just kind of go through them in order. But what a discussion guide lets you do is it helps you think through the questions, you get in the right mindset of what it is that you're investigating, and it's something that you can anchor back to throughout the conversation to keep you grounded in what it is that you're actually trying to learn. So we're going to talk about the steps to figure out questions that go into that discussion guide, and then the second topic we'll get into is how do you organize those questions into the discussion guide. Okay, step 1, super important. Before you get into any of this, you need to define your learning objectives. What is it exactly that you are trying to figure out? This is super important, and we actually will keep our learning objectives at the top of our discussion guides so that if you're going into an interview, the first thing you do is remind yourself, what am I actually trying to find out here? So it keeps you anchored in the right priorities during the interview. It helps you prioritize what questions even go on here. And it helps you evaluate how successful you've been in this discovery interview process, right? Have you actually achieved these objectives? Do you need to do more interviews, right? So really important to have these hammered out before you jump into this process. A couple of tips for how to go about actually sourcing learning objectives. You should never do this in a vacuum because learning objectives are basically going to frame your entire methodology to this process. They are going to have a huge impact on what the output of that process is. So anybody who's going to be making decisions using the output of this process should probably be involved in shaping these learning objectives with you. So you can do that by getting everybody in a room and just like kind of coming up with some ideas. Sometimes we actually will have like a learning objective brainstorm session specifically to just get ideas out there and come up with what we're going to focus on. Another approach is you might take a first pass at what you think the learning objectives are for a particular discovery process, and then invite input from your team and kind of evolve those together, but you need to make sure that you get input from the rest of your team. This is another important piece. A lot of times, learning objectives take the form of big questions that you want to answer. You want to separate what it is you need to learn from the questions that you'll actually ask. So I'll give you an example going back here. You can see one of the learning objectives we had here was what do people need and want when it comes to purchasing cryptocurrency? So that was kind of the big thing that we wanted to learn. I'm probably not going to go up to someone and be like, hey, what do you need and want when it comes to purchasing cryptocurrency? That doesn't make a great interview question because it's very broad. It's a little bit abstract. So you don't have to worry about these are questions you're going to actually ask people. These are like statements of what it is that you want to learn, and then you can come up with the questions you'll ask to really investigate and dig a little bit deeper around those learning objectives. So separate what you want to learn from the questions you'll actually ask. And then think about the people or the personas that you're going to be talking to. Think about what you need to know from the person and also what you want to know about that person. And again, these could be things that you're not necessarily going to ask them directly. But it may be something that you want to know, and then you're going to have to think about, okay, what questions can I ask them to really get at this learning objective? So things to keep in mind as you're sourcing those learning objectives. Once you have aligned your team on what your learning objectives are, you want those to be like 3 to 5 learning objectives probably that you can really kind of rally around. The next thing is to actually generate what are the things you're going to ask people when you're having this discovery interview with them. So we do something at Gitwit called a question storm. A lot of times people think about brainstorms as a way to generate ideas or solutions, but we like to use brainstorms for just about everything here. So this is our version of a brainstorm, but for questions. The goal of a question storm is to generate as many ideas as we can and as wide a variety of ideas as we can. This is how you get at better questions. You want to have a deep bench of questions that you can choose from. You don't want to be in the mindset while you're generating ideas of like, oh, I've got to get the perfect list. Cast your net wide first, and then you can narrow it down after the fact, right? So with a question storm, you don't want to get hung up right now in how you frame the questions, how they're phrased. You really just want to dig into like, what are some ways that we can talk to people and get people talking about the things that we want to learn. A couple of just really concrete tactics for running a question storm. If you're going to do this, you want to make sure that you've done a little bit of preparation. So one thing that you want to do is make sure that you've thought about grounding your team in the context. So don't just call people into a room and be like, all right, let's come up with questions to ask. Give them some context about like, why are you doing these interviews? What are you hoping to accomplish with this? What decisions might you be making with the output of these interviews, right? Help them to understand how this fits into the context of your overall strategy so they can contribute accordingly. You also want to be ready to share with this question storming group what your learning objectives are for your discovery research, who your target interviewees are, like who are you actually planning to talk to? And this isn't listing like a list of people and names. This is thinking through like, I want to talk to somebody who just graduated from college and they don't have a great deal of financial background, but they might be interested in investing in cryptocurrency. Or I want to talk to somebody who is a young parent and they're looking for inexpensive options to take their family out for casual dining, right? Like you're thinking through like, what's the category of person? What's the profile of person that you want to be talking to? You might have a couple different personas here. And then the last thing is, what's your planned approach? So you want to be able to ground everyone in like, we're planning on conducting 4 or 5 interviews. They're going to be 30 minutes each or 45 minutes each, just generally what your methodology is. You want to prepare this in advance, because the first thing you'll do when you get everyone in a room is kind of walk through these. And actually, for especially the learning objectives, target interviewees, and planned approach, I think it's really useful to walk through those and invite questions, concerns, really make sure that everybody understands what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And I might even make tweaks to them in that meeting, depending on the input of other people that are in the room. So you're going to spend a little bit of time on this, make sure everybody knows what you're doing. And then you get into actually just generating ideas for questions. This can be really simple. You pull up a shared document that everybody has access to, everybody's in the same room at the same time, and you start jotting down ideas for questions that you could ask. Using your learning objectives to frame the question storm is a really good approach. You can just start with learning objective number 1. What are some questions that we could ask to help us really address this learning objective? Get as many out there as you possibly can. Move on to the next one. Again, your goal is to come up with a really deep bench of questions that you can choose from when you're crafting that discussion guide later. And Kassie is going to talk about some additional strategies that you can use for sourcing questions and learning objectives that will really help you shape your methodology.
Got up too soon. Okay, so kind of touching a little bit on what Amanda was talking on, when we're thinking through what do we want to ask, and even our learning objectives, it's really helpful for us to think through the 5 rings framework. And it's just important to keep in mind that when you're crafting your persona, thinking through the profile, that your persona is not only based on demographics. It's really helpful to think through their motivations, their barriers, and how they're making decisions. Yeah, so a lot of times here at Gitwit, our learning objectives will include a concept or an idea that we want feedback on. So in these cases, it's really helpful to introduce some kind of visual tool to put in front of the people we're interviewing to make our concept or idea feel more concrete and real and give them something to react to. This is especially helpful when we're trying to get feedback on a specific product or feature idea. At this point, it doesn't have to be super defined. Again, we're just trying to get something in front of people to make it feel like we're showing them something that is real. This can be a pitch deck, a quick visual mock-up, or even a full clickable prototype. Okay, but before we even walk them through what our concept is and introduce it, we first want to get feedback on the problem that our concept is trying to solve for them. So what this might look like is, one big reason we do this is because when you introduce a concept or idea to people, you kind of bias them into automatically, they want to support your idea, they want to agree with you. But when you get kind of the perspective on the problem for them early on, you're really getting into their mind of, do they think this is a problem? Can they relate to this? So a good way to look at this is you can really get a good idea of how someone is going to perceive your concept without even showing it to them. This looks like if I walk someone through a problem space that my concept is seeking to solve, and they're like, I don't really have this problem, this doesn't relate to me, I kind of already have a good idea of how they're going to perceive my concept or idea before I show it to them. And really this can be a good approach not only for showing someone a concept, walking them through a concept deck, but it can be just as good for sharing ideas with your supervisors or your coworkers. Instead of coming to someone and saying, hey, I have a great idea for this problem you have, try taking a step back first, walking them through the problem that you think they have and getting their feedback on it. It can really change how you frame the solution in your own mind, and it might take you in a completely different direction. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through kind of an example of this process with a project we worked on here at Gitwit. So a while back, we were working on a concept idea related to a tool that was designed to increase the quantity and quality of feedback in the workplace. And again, before we even showed them our concept idea, we developed a pitch deck. But before we got to the part where we're like, hey, here's our tool, we first walked them through a narrative we crafted on what we thought their problem was when it came to feedback. So for example, we found companies were making huge investments in employee engagement, but despite this, most employees still feel like they're not getting enough feedback. So throughout this, we invited them to disagree with what our problem space was and really articulate what the problem was in their own words. And this is a good way to gauge what their perspective is, what their actual problem is, and it can really change how you ask questions about your concept and even think through what else might the solution be able to solve for them. Okay, so once you've gotten feedback on the problem space, we introduce them to our actual concept. Again, at this point, it doesn't have to be super well defined or thought out. We really just wanted to get this concept in front of people before we started digging in and taking the time to decipher how this would work. Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Amanda to go into how to take those questions we stormed and put them into a discussion guide.
Thank you. Okay, so you've done this, and now you have a big pile of questions, right? Because we said you're supposed to come up with these ideas, you're seeking to generate a quantity and diversity of ideas. How do you actually go from this big pile of question ideas to something that you can take into an interview? Whoops, clicked the wrong way there. So the first thing that you want to do is just start by grouping and prioritize the questions. So I like to do this, like I'll just take the document of questions that were generated in the meeting, and I'll literally just sit there and I'll start copy pasting them into like groups in that document. And I'm looking for themes, right? Like if there's a lot of questions along a certain theme, I'm going to group them together. And I'm going to do a little bit of a like a learning objective audit. Like, do I feel like I have enough questions to address each of the learning objectives that my team came up with in the first place? And I might end up adding some additional questions. Or if I see that there's a really big hole under one of the learning objectives, I might call the team back in and be like, hey, we need to like brainstorm some additional questions in this area and really make sure that we're addressing all the things that we said that we were going to address with this. This is also the time when you actually can eliminate some questions that are duplicates. You might mash some questions together. There might be some questions in there that you're like, oh, this is a really great idea, but I'm gonna maybe frame it a little bit differently. So you start kind of cutting it down a little bit, cutting out ones that you think are maybe gonna be less effective at reaching the goal. And then this is really important too. As you're starting to do this, you wanna keep in mind, most of these interviews are only gonna last 30, 45, maybe 60 minutes. You wanna highlight a handful of questions that you're like, I really want to make sure I ask this. Because the interview is going to be conversational. You may end up going off in some unexpected direction. So when you get to the last 10 minutes, you want to be able to look and be like, did I hit those bolted questions? So really think through like, what are the most important ones that you want to make sure you ask and flag them for yourself somehow as you're doing this. So you're starting to develop themes. You might even prioritize themes within this too. Be like, I'm gonna start with this one because I really wanna make sure that I hit this. And maybe there's some less important themes that you put down at the end, like if you have time to get to them. This is also the time where you wanna think about how you're actually phrasing the questions and asking the questions. The best questions are really open-ended and invite a narrative. As Dan was talking about earlier, this process is all about not just confirming hypotheses that you already have, but looking for hidden insights that you didn't know were there. So you're gonna do a lot better at accomplishing that when you're able to just invite that person to talk. Tell you about their experience, tell you a story. You might find in those details some really interesting insights you didn't even know were there. You also wanna avoid leading questions. So these are questions that kind of guide someone to, or bias them towards a particular answer. Anything related to feelings or sentiments, you want to try to cut those out. So you just want to do a pass through it and try to rephrase your questions with that in mind. An example here, right? Like rather than asking them what makes your current software hard to use, which you're kind of biasing them towards like, oh, what are some problems with it? Ask them to walk you through how they use their software, tell you what's working, what's not. Now you're giving them an opportunity to maybe rave about the software that they have, or maybe complain about it, or at the very least, just give you some insight into what they like, what they don't like about what they're currently using so that you can use that to influence what you're gonna do going forward. Another thing that you want to think about is ordering those questions like within each topic. So you are probably going to have some more closed-ended questions that you want to ask, and that's totally okay. But once you introduce bias of any kind, once you introduce a concept to someone, you cannot take that back. The beginning of the interview is prime time to seek input and seek information from them without having been biased by what they think you're looking for. So you want to start off early in the interview by asking the most open-ended questions. And if you have some questions where you're going to float a concept by them, like Kassie was talking about, or you want them to rate or rank something, you want to do that more towards the end so that it won't bias whatever your outputs are for some of those earlier questions. So you want to think through ordering. You don't want to context switch too much, so I would recommend that you do this ordering within each topic area. And then you might move to a new topic and start over again with a more open-ended question and getting less open-ended. So you just want to think through that and make sure that you make the most of the unbiased time that you have with them at the beginning of the interview. The last thing is, once you've gotten all of your questions and your ducks in a row with that, is you want to add an introduction. So really important to give the person an idea of what you're trying to accomplish, but not too much information so that you bias them. Again, you're trying to validate a problem first, so you don't want to start off by being like, hey, I've got this great solution, let me tell you all about it, and then jump into it, right? Keep it kind of lightweight. You want to emphasize here at the beginning that they're actually doing you a favor by giving you critical feedback. right? People want to be nice and agreeable to you most of the time. So if you tell them, like, I'm actually looking, like, this is the time for negative feedback, like, I would like to get that right now. And then ask them for permission to record. Cassie's going to talk more about that in a minute there at the beginning. You also want to plan for a couple of just like softball questions just to kind of open up the conversation, establish rapport. Something like, tell me about your role, tell me about your current company, that kind of thing. You don't have to read this like a script. You shouldn't actually read this like a script, but having it written out will help you to just remember, okay, yeah, this is what I need to talk to them about before I jump into questions. And once you've added the intro and warm-up questions, you've got a discussion guide that you can take with you into your interviews. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to Kassie to talk about what you do with that discussion guide when you're conducting an interview.
Okay, great. So a discussion guide is a really powerful tool for helping you conduct an effective interview, but it's really important to keep in mind that it's just that, it's a guide. The last thing you want to do is when you're conducting an interview is feel like you're reading off of a script. That can feel really uncomfortable both for yourself and for the person you're interviewing. So a good interview should be a back and forth. It should be conversational. You should be reacting to the things the people are saying to you. Oftentimes, our best insights will come from the follow-up questions that we didn't have baked into the discussion guide. So that just goes to say, use the discussion guide as kind of something to fall back onto in case you lose your footing or don't know what to ask, but don't be afraid to kind of stray from it and go where the conversation takes you naturally. So we like to use a third party to source our interview subjects. It can be really tempting to source interviewees from your immediate network, and that's fine sometimes, but the people who know you tend to want to support you and your ideas. So you might be getting false feedback from them that you might not have otherwise. So we've had a lot of success with userinterviews.com. This is not a paid plug. This is something we use. For B2B interviews, the cost is less than $200 an interview, and it's about half that for B2C. And this isn't only a good way to get people outside of your immediate network, it's also just a really good way to ensure that you're connecting to your target persona. User interviews lets you get pretty granular with the interviewees that you're sourcing. You can go into industry, role, and you can get pretty granular with what demographics you choose as well. Okay, so at Gitwit, we record every single interview we do. And this is really important for a few reasons. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier. A good interview, you're actively listening and responding to what people are saying. So when you're really focused on trying to quickly capture everything, type it down, people are saying, you're not really engaged in that conversation and asking those good follow-up questions. And then afterward, when we record an interview, we like to go back through the transcript and actually find more insights. Even when I'm the one who conducted the interview, I'm always finding new surprising things that I didn't notice in the moment. And I'll go into that a little bit more here in a moment as well. And then lastly, we want to be factually correct. It's really hard to have a misunderstanding or get something wrong when you have a recording to refer back to. Yeah, so as you do your research in your interviews, you're going to become more informed, and then naturally your questions are going to become more informed as well. So every couple of interviews, I like to revisit my discussion guide and kind of edit it and refine it based on what I've learned so far. So if a certain pattern starts to emerge, or I'm kind of picking up on a specific pain point that a lot of people seem to be having, I'll actually go back and I might completely pivot and go in a completely new direction with my discussion guide. It really just depends on what I learn. Okay, so after you've conducted all of your interviews, time to take the time and analyze everything you learned. Okay, so when I come out of these interviews, I have pages and pages in pages of transcripts, notes, ideas, and it can really feel overwhelming at first. And it can also be tempting just to jump out of an interview, get with my team, and jump into decision-making mode. But it really is so critical to take the time to step back and analyze your findings in a methodical way. And this is really the time when you're looking back on all of your research and the interviews you conducted. This is when the real trends start popping out to you. You're really getting those big key takeaways that you're going to want to share with the rest of your team and the stakeholders. So I'm going to go through a few tips for how we approach our analysis here. Transcribing and reviewing every interview, and down to pulling those quotes from our interviews and pulling them into a deck. Okay, I know I've said this time and time again, but we take the time to transcribe and review every single one of our interviews. We'll actually start by reading our interview transcripts and highlighting quotes that either speak to one of our learning objectives or just seem like a key insight to the persona type or their pain points. Really, every time I look at a transcript, I learn something new, something different jumps out to me. There's actually a story I love to talk about. I had a mentor who was an investigative journalist who swore by this practice, would do it every couple of days with her interviews. But she actually found an insight doing just this that launched a year-long investigation and ultimately won her a Pulitzer Prize. So this can be a really powerful tactic. When you're focused on something, you don't know what you're missing. So really powerful. For our transcription services, we like to use rev.com or fireflies.ai, but there's a lot of good resources out there. Okay, so once we highlight all of the quotes we want to share and feel like addresses our learning objectives, we'll actually create a spreadsheet that pulls all of those quotes in and categorizes them. And we do this because at this point, we have a lot of good insights and quotes, but we're still dealing with pages and pages of transcripts. And it can be kind of difficult to get your head around what matters in here, what are the trends, what are the patterns, and how do I share this with my other team members or stakeholders. So I'm going to walk through an example that we did for the feedback concept I mentioned earlier. Embrace yourself. This looks like a lot at first, but I'm going to walk through what this all means and how we created it. So again, at this point in our feedback concept, we had interviewed a lot of people. We had gone through our transcripts, highlighted everything that mattered, but it was kind of overwhelming. So we took all of those quotes and organized them into this spreadsheet that's way less scarier than it looks. Okay, so as you can see within the spreadsheet, we have a tab for each area of exploration. These tabs are going to look different based on your project, your learning objectives, who you talked to, what you learned. In our case, we kind of source these from our persona profiles, so their current processes, their pain points, as well as our learning objectives. So what makes feedback hard spoke directly to one of our learning objectives. Okay, and then within that spreadsheet, so we're in the tab, what makes feedback hard? And then within each one of those tabs, we'll actually go in and add a title and summary to the top of each sheet. So in this case, when we look at, okay, what makes feedback hard? The summary of that was, what are some of the challenges that interviewees shared about what makes feedback so difficult? And the reason we do this is when we click into that tab, it's just really easy to identify what the overall takeaway, what's the theme of this area of exploration. Okay, and then we'll actually go in and we'll group the quotes into separate columns depending on the theme, what they were talking about. And then we'll write a headline for each quote group at the top of that column. And to kind of make sense and tie it all together. So we're in exploration area, what makes feedback hard? We have the summary. What are some of the challenges that interviewees shared about what makes feedback so difficult? And then example, one of the themes that we found that makes feedback really difficult was people were worried about damaged relationships. So people worry that critical feedback has the potential to initiate conflict and damage working relationships, which would make their day-to-day more difficult. So we kind of, and you'll see other ones, politics and culture make it feel unsafe, conflict avoidance and discomfort. And then again, under each one of those, we grouped the relevant quotes. And you'll notice it looks a little bit colorful. So we'll actually create a separate tab where we list each one of our interviewees and we'll assign them a color. And this is because when we're looking at our spreadsheets, it makes it really easy to identify who said it. And it also makes it to where we can easily discern, okay, was this one person bringing up this pain point over and over again, or is it different people speaking to it? Okay, so we have this great spreadsheet, really powerful tool for pulling out the key insights and identifying what matters, but it still can be a little tricky passing that on to someone else and expecting them to quickly digest it and have those learnings actually stick with them. So from here, what we'll typically do is we'll create some kind of deck or brief where we'll pull out those, let me go back one. We'll pull out those titles that we talked about, like damaged relationships, politics and culture, and we'll put it as a headline. So in this case, it was, people worry about the political ramifications of delivering candid and constructive feedback. And then underneath that, we'll kind of expand on that a little bit, add a synopsis. And for each of these slides, we'll actually pull out direct interview quotes that support that finding. And this is just a really helpful way for us to help the rest of our team or our stakeholders build empathy with our target persona. And it's also just a better way to tell better stories. Okay, so I know I just went over a lot, so I'm gonna hand it back to Amanda to kind of review everything.
Okay, we promised you guys a crash course.
That spreadsheet.
Okay, so just the big takeaway here is that you want to approach interviews like a scientist. Your goal is not to get an idea out there and get people going, yeah, that sounds good. You're actually actively looking for things that maybe you didn't consider or that maybe go against what that hypothesis was, so that you can make sure that you and your team are chasing the right efforts, that you're making investments wisely, right? It sounds like a lot, but ultimately, if you can get the problem that you're solving right, it is going to help you to develop way more impactful solutions for your customers or within your company, wherever it is that you're trying to do solution development. So you want to make sure that you're asking the right questions. You want to make sure that you're taking a systematic approach, that you're thinking through how you're ordering those questions, how you're asking those questions. You want to stay open-minded throughout this entire process to finding something that you didn't expect. Even when you're on your very last interview, you might hear something that you're like, oh my gosh, I never heard that before. That's really interesting. So you want to stay open-minded that whole time. And then you want to make sure that you take this time to do the analysis and not just kind of run away with your first impressions after having these conversations. Like Kassie said, it can sound like a lot, but sometimes the magic and the insights actually come by going through and doing this empirical analysis of all of the things that have come out of that interview. So we have shared some resources with you. They should be in your inbox already, or they will be soon, to help you with this if you want to try to implement some of this with your team. So one of them is a question storm canvas that actually outlines how to approach putting together a discussion guide. It's got some of those questions that I talked about for like how you prepare for a good question storm. So you can use that with your team to potentially kickstart some of your own discovery process. And then we've also created a template of that spreadsheet that Kassie was going through, that like monster spreadsheet. So we've shared a template with you guys that has some instructions for how you might use it and has an example as well of like how we used it in our research. So again, hopefully that'll kickstart you a little bit in doing some analysis from discovery when you get there. And I know that this sounds like a lot, right? You're looking at this, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many steps to this. What I would recommend for you, right? Like if you're really thinking, like I really want to spend some time digging into problems, share the resources we provided with your team and just start at the beginning, right? Get into a room with whoever is involved and just say, what do we want to learn? What do we want to know? What do we want to investigate? And you might be surprised at some of the interesting stuff that comes up. Once you have that idea of what you want to learn, it becomes pretty energizing. And from there, you can use the framework we've talked about today to outline a roadmap for how you might want to proceed with that. And that roadmap is probably going to change, like we said. So you don't even want to go in being like, oh, we're going to do this big thing. I will say that there is power in even doing like 4 or 5 discovery interviews, right? So it doesn't have to be like, I'm going to talk to 30 people. So it doesn't have to be such a huge lift. Like even just having a few of these will yield you some really valuable insights that could potentially change the way that you approach whatever solutions you are building.